And I'm going to hand over to Jim to talk you through this topic of, can student opportunities really keep going?
Now, there's a question. Just remind me, how long's the session on? An hour?
You've got up to an hour, yeah.
Right, okay.
We're trying to finish them at about 10 to, so we've got time for changeover. So, but I'll warn you when we're about 5 minutes near the end.
Good, okay. Lovely to see everyone. Not that I can see you, but you see my point. It's just a turn of phrase. Afternoon. Thank you to Rosie and friends and colleagues, Organised Fun, for the invite. Real pleasure to be here this afternoon. Fantastic event. Hope people have got plenty out of it today, and obviously there's more to come. I am actually going to have my eye on two things during this session. So I am actually going to present some material that I've pre-prepared, but I also have my eye on something. So I have my eye on the Guardian Live blog, partly because there's a major news story brewing today about the way in which Leicester might get locked down as a place. So if you've seen, well, almost any politician over the past 2 or 3 weeks, but certainly Boris this morning, Matt Hancock over the weekend talk, you'll have heard in particular Boris talk about the need to, what he describes as whack-a-mole, particular geographic areas where there are outbreaks in this phase. And partly what's going on there is an assumption that as we enter this new phase, which is kind of pre-vaccine but post-peak, to avoid going into a kind of big, punishing, unpleasant, single national lockdown of the sort that we had obviously when everyone went into lockdown back in March, that instead very specific chunks of the country will be sent into lockdown. Now, depending on which document you read, which bit of guidance you look at and so on, sometimes that's framed as a particular community, a particular geographic area, sometimes a particular building. And what becomes very interesting about all three of those concepts that I've just talked about is that at any one time you could identify in a city students as a particular community. You could identify particular geographies inside some cities. So some cities have more students than others, and some parts of some cities have more students than others. And you can also identify buildings, campuses, as being places that you might decide you want to shut down if you're the local director of public health. And you know your local university agrees and or you're given the powers. So the way in which these kind of micro lockdowns, these local lockdowns pan out over the next 4 or 5 weeks, this big first one today looks like it will be in Leicester, will be really interesting to see in terms of giving us clues about what might go on to happen in universities, in university cities, on university campuses, and so on. So definitely one to keep an eye on, and I've written about some similar things with colleagues on our site. Very quickly before I carry on for too far, just to explain what Wonkhe is. Wonkhe is the home of higher education, policy people and politics. We're sort of a blog and a think tank and a portal for thinking about the future of higher education in general. And part of our kind of dream in life, our mission on earth, if you like, is to get the debate about the future of higher education out of the kind of oak-panelled rooms of London and into the hands of academics and administrators and students and you know, people, all, you know, to kind of if not formally, then certainly informally democratise the debate about higher education. And of course, there are really important debates going on, have been going on, will be going on, and are going on today about the way in which higher education will come back, reopen, if you like, not that higher education ever closed, but come back in September. And student activities has found itself, student opportunities has suddenly found itself as a really important component of all of that for all sorts of really interesting policy reasons that I will go on to across the course of the next 15-20 minutes, and then very happy to take questions, get the debate going, and so on and so on. Right, I think that's enough preamble. First of all, just in terms of lockdown, if you like, coming out of lockdown, to give you a big backdrop, And some, looking at some of the names and the roles that are, appearing in the Zoom webinar chat, some of this will be more familiar, I guess, to some of you than others. There are some big realities about September that people are wrestling with inside the higher education sector. First of all is an assumption that there will be fewer students, and when there are fewer students, there's less money around. There's a really, really specific and obvious concern about a collapse in international student numbers, either because international students won't be able to fly to the UK, or will have changed their mind about flying to the UK and studying in the UK for all sorts of reasons. And we're talking multiple reasons here. The country that an international student is from might be in recession. The immigration arrangements in terms of quarantining and so on might be problematic. Currency fluctuations might have kicked in. And, it may well be that some international students are looking at the way that the UK has handled the pandemic, where our own Prime Minister has had coronavirus, and are deciding that the UK isn't a safe country either to come to or to complete one's studies in. So there's a really big concern about a collapse in international student mobility. And that's true right around the world, but certainly true in the UK. No one really knows the extent to it, the extent or depth of that problem yet. And clearly, given the amount of money generated by international students in the UK, and the way in which international student fees go on to subsidise the rest of the work of universities, that is a major, major, major concern for most universities. And look, the more international students at the university where you are, the more concerned the university will be about sensitivity to and income collapse from international students. Third thing to say on here is that, in theory anyway, COVID-19 doesn't make higher education any cheaper to run. In fact, quite the opposite. It makes higher education significantly more expensive to run. If you have a lecture theatre open, you've got to deep clean it 4 or 5 times a day. You are spending huge amounts of money at the moment on updating platforms and staff training in order to ensure that people are able to take courses online. You are spending more money on student hardship. You're spending more money on student mental health capacity and so on. So there are lots of ways in which higher education becomes more expensive to run in September rather than less expensive to run. Even though you might have significantly less money coming in, which is an interesting crunch to be in if you think about it. The other aspect of that crunch is a general capacity crunch. So the capacity crunch sort of runs like this. Whether it's 1 metre or 2 metres in terms of social distancing rules, you can have less people in rooms and on campus at a time. Many of you are students or volunteers or staff at universities that are pretty tightly packed actually on a Tuesday lunchtime. Difficult to get on the bus, right? All of those sorts of things. So you've got a capacity crunch with the easing of lockdown. That means that there's less, if you like, space, time, less seating. There's just less stuff to go around come September. That makes things very difficult. So, there may well be significantly less contact time, that's the formal contact time in terms of teaching that students will get, but also wider things. There may be less places to sit on campus. And certainly it's true to say that whereas for many years universities have been very keen to promote their campuses as sticky, where you want students to hang around and socially learn on campus throughout the day, it may well be that lots of universities are very keen actually to cause students to not hang around on campus in September, October, November, and so on. You then end up with a really interesting set of debates, a wider set of debates that are going around at the moment about risk. And just to give you a kind of flavour and hint of this, if you take the average student, certainly in terms of age profile, the risks from coronavirus are proven to be statistically very, very low. So there are some voices that are saying, why on earth, and this is certainly true in the schools debate, why on earth would we be restricting educational opportunity for young people, when, you know, the risks to them are so low. Clearly, though, with those low risks come high risks. And what I mean by that is, if it's the case that 90% of undergraduate students at your university are, you know, age 18 to 21 and are at low risk of coming to any harm as a result of the disease, that is a group of people who are likely not to be particularly concerned about social distancing rules and the spread of the virus. Fresh as flu passes round students very quickly in September. And that low risk, coming off the back of the, you know, the general sense of, you know, risks to young people, may well then generate a series of high risks for other people on campus, academic staff, professional services staff, mature students, and crucially, family and friends for commuter students and members of the local community, to the extent to which students interact with their local community. So, for example, if it's the case that undergraduate students in September during Welcome Week say, I don't care about your rules about social distancing, we're just going to have a series of house parties, you can see how you can fairly quickly model significant viral transmission amongst a student body in a city that generates a series of really very high risks for other people. And where the line is between these, still not really settled for all sorts of reasons that I'll come on to later, but those are the sorts of sets of risks that people are talking about. And here's the rub, folks. Many of you are involved in the running of and operation of student activities which are pretty much student-led. Group of students on a committee gets elected and will run the club or run the society or run the volunteers or whatever it might be. And frequently, you know, a component of our culture inside this sort of activity is that many of you will have been sent on, you know, health and safety risk assessment style training. What that sort of work is trying to do is put you in a position where you are taking responsibility for some of the risks that come out of the opportunities involved in students meeting together, hanging out, and so on. So any of you that have heard those talks about not running initiation ceremonies or, you know, drinking games on socials, those sorts of things, will be only too aware of the extent to which, in an average university and student union setting, that it's important to try to devolve some of the responsibility around risk management onto those people who are very close to students who are running activities. The problem is, if it is the case that the risk amongst the student group that you're involved in is very low, but there is pressure from the university and or the students' union to make sure that you, for example, don't really hold any social events at all in the first term, that doesn't half put many of you that are involved in the running and operation of many of these activities in a really difficult kind of crunch place. And certainly, my view is that, you know, there will need to be additional discussion and conversation as we approach September, and some, you know, clarity emerges about how, you know, lockdowns and risk will work in that kind of student social space, in order to make sure that we don't put undue pressure on those people who operate and run and think about student activities. Let me cover a kind of bunch of other issues before I'm, you know, kind of take questions and do some debate and so on and so on. First is this. So there is plenty of research into and thought about what it is that students are investing in or buying when they sort of enroll. And this isn't a debate about whether students are consumers, but this is a debate about the different sorts of things that, for instance, a university might believe itself to be responsible for, and the extent to which you're able to control some of these things. So if you look right at the bottom there, I think it's probably fairly well established for most people that one of the things that you're buying, that's absolutely at the core of what you're buying when you sort of pay your tuition fees, if indeed you pay tuition fees, is teaching and assessment, you know, the acts of teaching and assessment. And, you know, the reality is that most teaching and assessment in theory was successfully you might argue unsuccessfully, there's debate about that, but was moved online for the emergency part of the pandemic. And there's a different set of questions then about the extent to which that can be moved online and so on. Some of that's dependent on satisfaction. Some of you are involved in or know students on highly practical courses. A year abroad cannot be run online, arguably, although some people are trying, and so on and so on. So that teaching and assessment thing and the associated qualification, it's kind of important and central to all of this. Clearly, though, there are other things that students are paying for and funding and expect. For example, one of the things that students are buying access to are facilities and services, bulk of which are provided by provided by the university, some of which will be provided by the Students' Union, and these will be spaces, places to sit, the ability to get on EduRoam. Yeah, so facilities and services, lots of facilities and services. And, clearly there is an extent to which you are unable to access some facilities and services for as long as the social distancing and health impacts of the pandemic rumble on. As I say, in this gap between kind of now and when we get a vaccine and or when the virus dies out. There's then even wider than that, a bunch of other things going on. You kind of, a city, you're sold the city, aren't you? Look at this wonderful city, a bunch of experiences, friendships, social capital, the chance to find yourself and so on. And one of the things that I think is interesting about those kind of last two layers is that student opportunities sit very much in both of these areas. On the one hand, particularly if you've paid money to join a club or society, but not always. There's a bunch of things going on in clubs and SOCs and student opportunities that are about facilitated involvement that kind of fit here. And then there's a bunch of other things really that students are expecting that are about the ability to hang out with other people, find themselves, learn, develop social capital and so on, which is kind of that space in the yellowy orange part. Now, for really obvious reasons, universities have started at the outset of this process by thinking principally about the teaching and learning stuff, and are very slowly across the course of the summer moving out into the wider parts of this circle in order to determine what their offer is in relation to September. And that's where it gets kind of tricky, because lots of this is not within the control of universities, but is the sort of thing that students expect. And many of you that are on this list, are probably right on the edge of the kind of purple and sand colour there. You kind of facilitate some stuff, but you're also about social activity and so on, depending on the nature of the activity you run, and so on. And I guess the other thing to say is necessarily and inevitably, the priority inside most universities is very much at the centre and at the bottom of this chart. And the further you go out, it is of less importance. Now, you might argue that it ought to be of central importance. Some of you will argue that it's even more important than the teaching and learning. But, there's just a reality in terms of the way universities work and what they believe their principal purpose is and so on, in terms of the amount of planning and thinking that has gone on into how we come back in September. And what all of that relates to is this question about autonomy and control. Now, universities are autonomous. Unlike in some industries, there isn't going to be a document where the government says universities may now reopen, and they may now reopen in the following way. It's just not that simple. There's some very broad guidelines. And generally what that means is that universities and their own managers and academics and so on, and their own student unions are having to determine lots of the questions about the nature of reopening themselves in response to their own students, their own portfolio of activities, their own geography, their own issues, their own expectations, their own diversity and so on. And so what that does mean is that it is going to be important, both from a teaching and learning perspective, but also from a point of view of this question about what will be allowed, what can be run and so on in the student activity space, for students to be involved in that decision making throughout the course of the summer. I mean, seriously, it's the 29th of June today. Normally by now, decision making in universities has basically closed until September. The only decision making now normally relates to clearing. But clearly at the moment, every university is still having meetings every day to ask questions about what's going to be allowed, what won't be allowed, and so on. And student opportunities people are going to want to attempt to find ways, either through some of their elected officers in students' unions or through their management structures in universities, to influence some of this stuff about student opportunities. Not least because the danger is that whilst that teaching and learning thing gets fixed, that people forget this stuff. And if you don't have any of that stuff, then you actually also then harm the teaching and learning experience, as many of you will know, because you're involved in the delivery of student opportunities. The other thing to say about all of this is that there's a hell of a lot to do. Yeah, so universities have got to convert all their courses to online, if that's possible. Of course, it's possible in some cases, it's actually really difficult in others. Got to keep as many staff as possible and keep them motivated, but also got to save some money. Got to increase student financial support, rewrite every course, learn a million new ways of doing things, develop compelling alternatives to years abroad and placements, hit and exceed access targets for diverse students. Not all of that might be possible. So it might not be possible to do all of that, but we don't know at the moment where the line is and what it will be possible for universities to do and what it won't be possible for universities to do. And that will play out in the next few months. So that's an open question. We don't really know how, what will, if you like, fall off the end and won't fit in the jar. What we do have, though, is quite a bit of intel from students about their expectations. And just over 3 or 4 slides here, I've got just an example of that. So there's tons and tons of research out, actually, from various market research firms and various other companies that's given us over the months a slice of what students are thinking, expecting, feeling, and so on. This came out 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's as good as any other information. This is from a firm called Havas Education. They've done a study called Life Interrupted, and it looks at the expectations, hopes, and dreams of students that are about to go to university. Okay. And it talks about some of the things that you perhaps might expect it to talk about. So students are expecting there to be contingency plans for in-person studies. They want there to be answers in terms of what's likely to happen in September. They want a sense of what September is going to be like, both in terms of planning, but also in terms of making final decisions about whether to come or not. They're not, unsurprisingly, hugely happy about paying full tuition fees, and there's a separate conversation to be had on a separate day about whether and how universities should or have thought about fee discounts, fee relief, and so on and so on. They have a bunch of really practical concerns about courses. So the moment you move off of your sort of, lecture seminar, all chalk and talk stuff, there are deep concerns from prospective students about how that's going to work. So some really interesting quotes here, veterinary medicine student, an engineering student, so on and so on. Yeah, I've got real concerns, so practical concerns, and that's true for continuing students too, if you look at the research, for obvious reasons. But crucially, in terms of the wider student experience, there's a couple of things going on here. First is people are expecting universities to attempt to run things in smaller groups, which universities might not have the capacity and space to be able to do. They're expecting, responsive academic staff if they can't see them face to face. They want their personal tutor system to actually work. They want it to be easy to communicate with the university and to get responses back quickly, and so on and so on. And some of that might be possible, some of it might not. Certainly for those of you that are student reps, understanding the nature of contact that a student might want if they're basically not really allowed on campus much will become really important in terms of feeding that in. But crucially, outside of the academic experience, and that's really where this conference and this group of people that are on the call are focused, students are concerned they're going to miss out on the social experience. So let's put it like this. If any of you are involved in the running of a Disney club, Disney society, students aren't worried about missing the Disney bit. They're worried about the friendships they were going to make through the Disney society. Now, that's not quite true if you look at the research into sports. So there are some high performance athletes and some people that are really into their sport. But generally, the concern around club societies, volunteering, student opportunities in general is a social concern, that people won't have the opportunity to hang out with, make friends for life, and so on and so on. So you end up with some of these signature quotes, and I think some of these signature quotes are interesting. These are reflected in other research. So look at that first one. I think universities could help us get a decent onboarding and freshers experience by allowing that experience in some way in our second year. So some people want to see it actually run in the second year. Someone else says, can we have a freshers week when things go back to normal? I worry that we won't be going back to normal this academic year at all. I believe students should delay freshers week. Maybe the university could do loads of mini fresher experiences. That sounds more feasible until you think about the capacity required to do it. Universities could move clubs and socks online. Could. Many of you, I guess, that run clubs and socks will ask yourself, are students still going to pay the same amount? Will the mixing in them be meaningful? So, there are real questions about online joining of clubs and socks. An online introduction to our classmates and peers. Video calls with other people in our year. Zoom quizzes or Kahoots. If I go to one more Zoom quiz, I'm going to burst. And then setting up a group chat for freshers. So students are really concerned about this. And clearly, those of you involved in, as I say, the delivery of student opportunities, I've got a really important role to play here in terms of the kind of facilitation of opportunities for students to hang out, meet each other, and so on, either based around particular interests or identity or whatever that might be. I'll make all the slides available to Rosie and so on, and you can have a dig into that. And there are links to have a read of some of that research and some other research. So where does that get us? I mean, look, we do know a few things so far about what delivering student activities during a lockdown is like, and these lessons are of importance, I think, to those of you that are in the session this afternoon. First is that it's much harder to rely on student volunteers. And certainly to the extent to which you can rely on student volunteers to keep student activities going, there might be less student volunteers around. There might just be less students around. Yeah. Or students might suddenly be in lockdown, or they might be having to self-isolate. So, depending on students is a really interesting question that you're going to want to think about within your clubs and societies and more generally inside universities and student unions. Second is, we know from some of our friends in the online world, we know from friends and colleagues at the OU, for example, that there's a hell of a lot of work involved in keeping clubs and societies going, both during a partial lockdown and for reanimation purposes. And so, thinking about how to keep clubs and socks going, effectively furloughing clubs and societies is a really important concept to have a think about. Clearly, there's lots of pressure on universities to have an offer and to tell students what they can expect, and I'll come on to that in a minute. And all of this is going to require ongoing investment when students might not be able to invest in the way that they previously have. Of course, most universities and student unions, students co-invest in the funding of their clubs and socks. Let me come on to the kind of wider agenda, though, in terms of what's going on in universities and why. You might have seen 3 or 4 weeks ago this news story. So a vice-chancellor was on a Zoom call briefing the press about the plans that universities had to reopen and said that they were thinking about student social bubbles. Turned out this wasn't a very well thought through plan. But this has resurfaced tonight. So this evening, the government is in the process of briefing the press that large child bubbles of 240 students are going to be formed to enable schools to open. Do bear in mind that that depends on the idea that those children aren't really mixing with other children. And of course, one of the components and facets of the average student experience is that students mix with one hell of a lot of people, which is going to make the student social bubble thing really difficult. But what's really interesting about that announcement 2 or 3 weeks ago that was briefed to the press isn't the social bubble aspect. It's the fact that Universities UK felt the need to answer the question when the press question came in, which was, how are students going to socialise? And the student social experience is really, really important. Now, there are bits of the press that would characterise that as being a bit of a luxury, or would characterise that as an opportunity to get drunk. The truth is there's really good research about the way in which student social networking, student friendships and student activities reduce loneliness, reduce dropout, improve success rates in terms of people doing well in their academic study and so on. And so universities know that students are really concerned about the social experience, talked about that earlier, and are really, really keen to reinforce that there will be a social experience and have messages out around it. So this was 3 or 4 weeks ago. And then the week before last, Universities UK press released some research it had done with universities that really drove home this idea that the vast majority of universities would be offering some kind of face-to-face social activity. And now most students' unions and universities and volunteering departments and so on are in the process of working out what that might actually look like, feel like and sound like in order to satisfy that kind of big PR need. So student opportunities plays a really important role. The question is what you'll be allowed to do and what you won't be allowed to do. Here's the VC that talked about social bubbles. So from Staffs, Liz Barnes, the VC at Staffs. So hello to anyone on the call this afternoon from Staffs. It's your VC's fault. And as you'll see, I won't go into these slides in too much detail. Lots of concern about students and social activity and students being able to talk and so on and so on. So let's flick through all of that. Let's get to the final bits then. So as I said earlier, probably most of you are what I would call the red arrow here. So you are involved in the process by which these kind of wider experiences in the kind of sandy colour of the donut get facilitated. You put on social events, you recruit students to clubs and socks or volunteer positions or whatever that might be. You put on five-a-side tournaments and so on. So you're in the facilitated experiences space. And what I'd say about that is that the facilitated experiences are really important from a social perspective, from a reputation perspective, and from a university offer perspective, but there is less money and time and students to go around to do the facilitation. The sports hall that you think you might be able to use might have been, might now be being used for teaching in September. The field that you thought you were going to be able to use might be actually booked up. There is a question mark about whether or not facilitated experiences are put on for all students rather than just first year students. A lot of people I speak to in my day job, there's been a real focus on first year students, as if second years and third years won't need to socially network or talk to each other and so on and so on. So facilitated experiences are where it's at. Other thing to say just briefly is, Joe Walters, friend and colleague of Organised Fun, comms expert, a few weeks ago came up with this model that said, look, there are some things that students will be allowed to do and not allowed to do, some things that students will be willing to do and not willing to do, and some things that students will be able to do and not able to do. So, and understanding both the students and the activity is the key to working out whether students can and will and should take part then in the stuff that many of you put on. Really interesting model, worth having a play with. Won't spend too much time on it now. What I would say is it's worth spending some time on that red bit there. The early evidence from North America, from Canada, and from Australia, all of which have had partial reopenings of campuses, is that their big problem is with students that are willing to do things, able to do things, but not allowed to do things. House parties, hanging around at each other's houses, kind of permanent pre-drinks. And, if a university and or a students' union says that's a public health concern, you're not allowed to do that, and you are, running a club or society that has got a load of people around someone's house, we could be in really interesting territory in terms of student conduct rules, health and safety, risk assessments, and so on and so on. And the line between, the intersection between social activity that's got nothing to do with regulation and organised activity that is heavily regulated for risk. Many of you will be familiar with, the way in which you regulate risk in student activities. That red bit in the middle is the big concern for university campuses in the US, North America, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. So that will definitely be worth thinking about, and happy to take questions and have a think about that. So 2 final slides just to finish, and then very happy to take questions and talk about these things too. Broadly, what's going on then is there is a really important need, both morally, from a mental health point of view, but actually from a sort of consumer law and recruitment point of view, for universities to offer as much provision as possible that's face-to-face. And to some extent that depends on on-campus numbers, and to some extent on-campus numbers depends on saying that student activities and opportunities will run. There will be clubs and socks and freshers fairs and so on and so on. But clearly there's a capacity squeeze on things because of social distancing, and we don't know how tight that capacity squeeze will be. But campuses themselves represent a capacity squeeze because of social distancing rules, depending on where they get to. And there are associated test, track, isolate issues. Very briefly, just to say on this. At any one time, if you think about the rules that are in place today, if a student has symptoms, if you have symptoms, the dry cough and so on, and you live with 5 people, in theory, you're supposed to go home and inform your 5 housemates that they're not allowed to leave the house for 2 weeks. Now, that will cause a level of chaos for some courses, for some student activities, for some people, you know, that have got part-time jobs and so on in your student house. So that just personally is worth thinking about for students. But certainly for those people running student activities, that kind of self-isolation thing becomes an important factor to take into account. But then related to that are these wider issues of test, track, trace and isolate that relate to local lockdowns and the stuff I was talking about earlier, what might go on in Leicester this evening and the way in which kind of micro lockdowns will work. All of this might be a lot easier. All of this might be much more difficult come September. And certainly if it's the case that at any one time, a particular chunk of a campus or a particular block of halls of residence or a particular part of a university city might be in lockdown, that is going to make programming student activities, putting on events, doing things face-to-face, even more difficult than it already is because of capacity issues in terms of facilities on campus. So all of those things are going to be worth thinking about and seeking to influence to the extent to which decisions about them are made locally and institutionally. More broadly in relation to student ops, I'll finish after this slide and do questions and so on. Clearly for all of you involved in student opportunities, whether you're running a single club or society or whether you're a director of student opportunities for a large student union, whatever it might be, there's a balance in all of this between what I would call social and functional. Why do people join the rugby club? Is it to play rugby or is it to hang out with people, and drink and, have fun and so on and so on? There's clearly an important balance between social and functional. I think what I'd say is there's no doubt that there will be a squeeze on the functional because of facility squeeze, but there also may well be an unexpected for some people squeeze on the social because of the need to restrict the transmission of the virus amongst a bunch of people who frankly will think themselves to be fairly invincible at the best of times, let alone during this pandemic. So for those of you involved in influencing and running and putting things on and setting out the rules and so on, that's the number one policy question that I'd invite you to have a think about in the months ahead. Second is the ability to generate rather than recreate online friendships is in doubt. There is some research that says it's really bloody hard to generate friendships online rather than recreate them. Lots of the activity that ran this term was really about recreating activities and friendships that happened previously physically. Much harder to do. So that's going to be an interesting question for many of you. Many of you are going to be unable to charge for some of the things that you've traditionally been charging for, so you might have to think about that in terms of your own your own group or activity budgets. You clearly, most of you, have a really important role to play in reducing social isolation, but also you could be a source of social isolation to the extent to which students think there are lots of things going on, but they can't interact with them because they're sat in their room on their own because the pubs are closed or the parks are closed and they can't even hang out on campus. And as I say, there will be really important questions about the rules that will surround student groups and activities and who will enforce them and how they will be enforced. And on that bombshell, I'm going to kind of stop, take questions, and find out where Rosie's got to in terms of scooping up all the things that have come in on the Q&A.
Yes, hello. So I think from what you said, Jim, the summary of can student opportunities really keep going is that, yes, it can keep going, but it's going to be a highly facilitated experience that's going to be possibly more expensive, definitely trickier, and require a heck of a lot more risk management. So for those of you that are massive fans of risk management already, there's more to come.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. I mean, I think the other thing I would say is, it is a legitimate question to say, to what extent is it the university or a students' union's job to police, what happens, in a city or whatever. But these are not unfamiliar questions for people involved in student activities, because there has always been this kind of lingering question about the risk assessment that gets done for what happens on the field, and whether or not the risk assessment should extend to what happens in the pub an hour later.
Yeah.
So, many people on this Zoom call will be familiar with these debates. The trouble is they won't necessarily have resolved them, and now they've got even harder.
Yeah. And I think from a risk management perspective, whether we like it or not, it's the same as when we're talking about sending students on tour, or not officially sending students on tour, but knowing that students are going on tour, but then going, la, 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 this has nothing to do with the SU. Unfortunately, if it's your groups that are going, it is something to do with the SU, and if someone gets hurt, you will be responsible at some point in that, and you'll be the one that's having to ring parents up and stuff. So it's a kind of similar situation to that. So looking at the questions, I'm really glad that people have been using the upvote thing. That's fun. The top questions, there's two, so we'll go with the first one. What should student society committees say if another question has now been upvoted. Anyway, we'll carry on with this one. What do we think that society committees say if and when their SU breaks the news that they have to cut budgets? Could be fine for some societies that have little or no expenses, but could ruin the bigger stuff, student media, sports, performance societies. What are your thoughts on that?
It's a really good question. I mean, what I would say is that it's a question that is very, very similar to the question that, for instance, faces those people in the UK right now that are running theatres.
Yeah.
So, if you take this at its macro, for as long as the furlough scheme, Rishi Sunak's furlough scheme continues, then theatre and the arts, to the extent to which they were able to comply with the rules, are able to pay people. Once the furlough scheme winds up, that's going to get very, very tough. They will be looking for a bailout very specifically because during this kind of new normal pre-vaccine period, they can't generate the income that they used to generate. And so, they will be arguing through DCMS and, into the Treasury that they need a particular type of furlough in order to survive. Now, the reality is, if you're a director of finance for a university, you're not an expert necessarily. I mean, it's very rare. Maybe there are some university directors of finance that have been student activities managers, or people that have run sports clubs. I doubt it.
I've never met any.
No, I mean, they're a different sort of person. They won't understand that a straight line cut across a university will have different impacts in different ways, and that actually some of the things that we know are central to student mental health and the offer in the prospectus, the sort of stuff I've talked about, unless they are, if you like, furloughed in a particular type of way, might not survive, and may not be able to then be put on in January, may not survive to next September. Now, in some cases this will be student clubs responding to what a student union decides. In some cases, this will be clubs with a student union responding to what the university decides. There are different levels at which you might have to do lobbying and campaigning across the course of the summer and so on. But I think the general principle is you do want to attempt to be in a position where decision makers that are having to make really difficult decisions in the next few months in terms of budgets understand that in some cases, some of this isn't really going to be able to run for the year ahead, and that you're going to need support to be able to, as I say, furlough it. So as I say, this is really about furlough in principle rather than the kind of practice of the Treasury scheme. This is about getting into people's heads. Blimey, unless we take some very specific action with certain types of activity, we might go from 150 societies to 50 societies in a year, and that would look terrible in the prospectus. Frankly, to oversimplify this, do I think your average sports club could still recruit, if it doesn't recruit any students in 2021, in 2020 over in 2021? May well be able to. Could a fairly shaky, I don't know, Chinese board game society run if it only has 10 members now? I'm not sure it will survive, will it? And so those are your questions really, in terms of making sure that people are investing not just in their kind of general revenue budgets, but also in, you know, making sure the activity survives into either January or 2021.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Our second top question, which is the last one I think that we'll probably have time for, is, do you think that SUs should be taking a parental role and putting a very clear, you can't do this activity rule in place?
Well, I mean, look, that is a difficult question to answer now, for two reasons. One, it depends on where you were on that question before COVID-19, to be honest. And secondly, we don't know where the rules will be more generally. I mean, I think what I would say generally on this is, we will want to avoid backing ourselves into a position where it is somehow seen as the responsibility of students and or student unions to cope with these really, really difficult issues of student conduct all on their own. And that might involve losing a bit of power in the process, but you're not going to want to be held responsible for this. And what I'd say about that is, if you take the issue of sexual misconduct, sexual harassment and sexual misconduct over the past few years, clearly some clubs and societies and student unions have wanted to keep for themselves the idea that they regulate the behaviour of and conduct of sports clubs, societies, student volunteers and so on. It clearly doesn't make any sense if you've got someone, you know, that is a serial sexual harasser or someone involved in sexual misconduct, where the only punishment that they could receive is, you know, not being able to go to the chess club. You know, you want the university to deal with that as a piece of casework. Now, therefore, I think my view on this stuff around student opportunities in relation to September is, you probably don't want to be in a position where the default assumption in an institution is that the people who run sports clubs, societies and student volunteering are the people that will police student conduct. Don't think that's fair. And to give you an example, there are a couple of US universities over the past 4 or 5 weeks since they've reopened have tried to recruit student volunteers to police other students' behaviour on campus. And in most of those examples, that has gone really badly wrong.
Mm-hmm.
They've ended up having to employ actual staff to do it rather than, you know, saying to students, you will do it. So, you know, my general advice, try to avoid strategically students being made responsible for this problem.
Good question, good answer there. And that answers another question that someone else had put lower down, really, about putting responsibility on committee members. So thank you for that. We're going to have to wrap up here because we're nearly on the hour, and there's one more set of sessions after this one, and I don't want people to miss out on that. And it's obviously important for people to have a loo break and get a drink and stuff. So thanks for going through that and for answering those questions. For anybody who didn't have their questions answered, I'll copy those, and I suggest Jim's a bit of a Twitter fan, so I can pose a few of those on Twitter, and then as and when he gets a moment in between watching what's going on in Leicester, that he might be able to answer a few of those. But also it'll be really interesting to see what you all think, so I'll pop those on Twitter from Organised Fun HQ, and then we'll see what everybody says about that. If anybody wants to carry on chatting about this, I've put a link to Coffee Shop Table 2 in the chat. The coffee shop is a Google Hangout. It doesn't look like a coffee shop, and unfortunately it doesn't smell like a coffee shop. But the idea is that you can have your informal chats in there. So if anyone wants to carry on chatting about it, head over to the coffee shop in the link. But yeah, thank you, Jim, and thanks for everybody for participating.
Pleasure. See you soon. Take care.
See you all soon. Bye.